The first tremor wasn't the eviction notice. It was the color of my petunias. Fuchsia, apparently, was an affront to the harmonious beige-scape Brenda Butterfield, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, had meticulously curated. My name is Alex, and for 15 years, my life had been a quiet symphony of redacted files, silent observation, and the kind of authority that doesn't need a uniform to be felt. My home was my sanctuary, the place where the call signs and the code words faded, replaced by the laughter of my daughter, Lily, and the scent of my wife, Sarah's rose garden. A garden that, incidentally, also featured several non-compliant varietals. Brenda's reign had begun subtly, a creeping vine of passive-aggressive notes about recycling bins left out an hour too long, the precise angle of a parked car. Petty. Annoying. The kind of bureaucratic static I usually filtered out with professional ease. But Brenda wasn't just static. She was a feedback loop of escalating self-importance. She patrolled the cul-de-sacs in her golf cart, a self-appointed monarch surveying her beige kingdom. Her pronouncements, delivered with the gravity of papal bulls, were posted on the community notice board. Each new rule a fresh encroachment on common sense. All holiday decorations must be removed within 48 hours of the designated holiday. Lawn maintenance standards require grass height not to exceed 2.5 inches. Subject to bi-weekly vernier caliper inspection by an authorized HOA representative. That representative was always Brenda, caliper in hand, a glint of zeal in her eye. My family was the reason I tolerated it, the reason I chose measured indifference over the kind of confrontation my training screamed for. Lily needed stability. Sarah deserved peace. So, I paid the absurd fines for unnatural lawn striping patterns and excessive wind chime sonority. I even, much to Sarah's amusement, painted the fuchsia petunia planter a dull, HOA-approved taupe. I thought, naively, that compliance would starve the beast. I should have known narcissism feeds on acquiescence, mistaking it for fear, then for weakness. The day it all fractured began with a pounding on the door, not a polite knock, but the kind of percussive assault designed to intimidate. I was in my study, reviewing a particularly dense intelligence brief, something involving international arms traffickers, a world away from Meadowbrook Estates. Lily was at school, Sarah at her clinic. I opened the door to find Brenda, flanked by two men in ill-fitting navy blue shirts, emblazoned with a cheap Meadowbrook security patch. They looked less like security and more like extras from a low-budget cop show, the kind whose characters get shot in the first 5 minutes. One was paunchy, with a mustache that seemed to be making a desperate escape from his face. The other was young, jumpy, eyes darting everywhere but at me. "Alex Parker?" Brenda chirped, holding a clipboard like a scepter. Her voice, usually a reedy whine, had taken on a forced, authoritative timbre. It was almost comical, if the intent hadn't been so venomous. "You are hereby served with an immediate eviction notice for persistent and egregious violations of the Meadowbrook Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions." She thrust a sheaf of papers at me. I didn't take them. My gaze, cold and steady, moved from her to the two officers. "Eviction?" I kept my voice level, devoid of inflection. This was a tactic I used in interrogation rooms, a calm that often unsettled those expecting an explosion. "Brenda, you've been hitting the Chardonnay a bit early today, haven't you?" A flicker of anger in her eyes. "This is no laughing matter, Mr. Parker. Article 7, Section B. Subsection 4 clearly states that the association has the right to reclaim property in cases of incurable non-compliance." The paunchy one puffed out his chest. "We're here to ensure you vacate the premises peacefully. We have the authority to remove you by force if necessary." He actually hitched up his trousers, as if preparing for a bar fight. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. This wasn't a fine for a rogue garden gnome. This was an attempt to seize my home, to displace my family, based on the delusions of a petty tyrant. My mind, trained for rapid threat assessment, cataloged the scene. Brenda, emboldened by her hired muscle. The security goons, likely unlicensed, definitely out of their depth. The flimsy legal pretext. A slow, cold anger began to uncoil within me, an emotion I rarely indulged but always respected. It was a precise instrument, not a blunt object. And what specific, incurable non-compliance are we talking about today, Brenda? I asked, my tone still deceptively mild. Is it the unapproved curvature of my driveway again? Or have my daughter's sidewalk chalk drawings been deemed a threat to public order? She flushed. It's an accumulation, Mr. Parker. A pattern of defiance. The unpermitted birdbath, the consistently late HOA dues, which, by the way, are now subject to a further penalty for this action, and your general contempt for community standards. The birdbath. My grandfather, a stern man who taught me about real lines in the sand, had carved it from granite the year Lily was born. The late dues were a fabrication. I paid everything meticulously online, digital receipts archived. Her eyes, however, darted towards my study window, where a sliver of a restricted satellite dish, essential for my actual work, was barely visible behind the blinds if one knew exactly where to look. Had she seen it? Was this the real trigger? This wasn't just about power anymore. It was about a perceived slight she was magnifying into a casus belli. These men, I said, nodding towards her entourage. Are they licensed by the state? Are they bonded? Do they understand the legal ramifications of attempting a forcible, unlawful eviction? The jumpy one shifted his weight. Paunchy scowled. We work for the HOA. President Butterfield gives the orders. Brenda preened. Exactly. And I order you to pack your things and leave. Now. She actually took a step towards my threshold. That was the line. Not a line drawn in beige paint, but a fundamental boundary of hearth and home. The calm I'd maintained wasn't passivity. It was the quiet before the strike. They had mistaken patience for weakness. They had mistaken a man who valued peace for a man who couldn't wage war. They were about to receive a very abrupt, very thorough education. My hand didn't move towards a weapon. It didn't need to. My voice, when I next spoke, had dropped a full octave, losing all pretense of neighborly discourse. It was the voice I used when lives were on the line, when there was no room for misunderstanding. Brenda, I said, and her smirk faltered. You and your associates are currently attempting to commit several felonies. Trespassing, attempted unlawful eviction, harassment, and, depending on what your security friends think they're doing, potentially impersonating law enforcement officers. Before this goes any further, I suggest you consider the definition of incurable non-compliance when applied to federal statutes. I let that hang in the air, the silence stretching taut. They thought they were the authority here. They were about to find out what real authority looked like. The initial shock of their audacity had solidified into a cold, hard certainty. This wasn't just an attack on my property. It was an attack on my family's security, on the very concept of lawful order they pretended to uphold. Brenda, bless her malignant heart, was too insulated by her own perceived power to grasp the shift. She actually scoffed. Federal statutes? Don't be ridiculous, Mr. Parker. This is Meadowbrook Estates. My rules apply here. The younger security guard, the one with the darting eyes, suddenly looked like he wished he'd called in sick. He licked his lips, a nervous tick. The paunchy one, however, emboldened by years of unchecked HOA bullying, stepped forward. Look, buddy, we don't want no trouble, but President Butterfield says you gotta go. So, are you gonna go, or do we make you go? He reached out, as if to take my arm. My movement was economical, precise. I didn't strike him. I simply shifted my weight, my hand, coming up to gently but immovably block his arm. His momentum carried him slightly off balance. It was a small thing, but the message was clear. You cannot touch me. I said, my voice still low but now carrying the resonance of absolute conviction, that there's been a significant misunderstanding about who I am and what I do. I reached inside my jacket, slowly, deliberately. Brenda's eyes widened, perhaps expecting a weapon. The paunchy guard tensed. The younger one took a half step back. I withdrew my credentials. Federal Agent Alex Parker. The shield and ID were unassuming to the untrained eye, but to anyone with even a passing familiarity with law enforcement, they screamed consequence. Brenda, I stated, my eyes locking onto hers, stripping away every shred of her manufactured authority. You are attempting to evict a federal officer from his private residence without a court order, without legal standing, and on entirely fabricated charges. Your security personnel are complicit in this. This action, right here, right now, constitutes interference with a federal officer in the performance of his duties. Duties which, I assure you, extend to protecting my home and family from unlawful acts, regardless of who perpetrates them. The color drained from Brenda's face, leaving behind a mottled, unhealthy pallor. The paunchy guard's bravado evaporated like mist. He stared at the credentials, his jaw slack. The younger one looked like he was about to vomit. Federal, Brenda stammered, the word a weak puff of air. But your lawn, the petunias. The absurdity of her clinging to those petty grievances in the face of this monumental miscalculation would have been funny if the situation weren't so deeply offensive. The petunias, Brenda, I said, a sliver of ice in my tone, are the least of your concerns right now. You have crossed a line that doesn't just violate HOA bylaws. It violates United States Code. Your little reign of terror over unapproved garden gnomes and rogue wind chimes has just escalated into something far more serious. I paused, letting the weight of it sink in. The porch light, which Sarah had switched on earlier, cast long, stark shadows, transforming Brenda from a neighborhood nuisance into a cornered, rapidly deflating bully. You see, Brenda, I continued, the tactical part of my brain already cataloging her every reaction, every micro-expression. They didn't know I was a federal agent, but you do. Now. The moral violation wasn't just the attempted eviction, it was the arrogant assumption of power, the belief that her petty rules superseded fundamental rights, that she could harass and intimidate with impunity. It was the casual cruelty of threatening a family's home over perceived slights, and for that, there had to be a reckoning. This wasn't just about defending my property anymore. It was about dismantling a local tyranny, brick by petty brick. The game had indeed changed. She had brought a clipboard to a gunfight she didn't even know she was starting, and I always came prepared. I suggest, I said, my voice a calm, lethal whisper, you and your associates remove yourselves from my property immediately. And Brenda, we will be having a much more detailed conversation about those HOA finances and your interpretation of authority very, very soon. Consider this your only warning. The retreat was less a dignified withdrawal and more a panicked scramble. Brenda, for once, was speechless, her face a mask of dawning horror. The paunchy security guard practically tripped over his own feet, backing away, mumbling apologies. The younger one just bolted, disappearing down the street, as if the hounds of federal justice were literally nipping at his heels. I watched them go, the adrenaline slowly ebbing, replaced by a cold, focused anger. This wasn't over. This was the overture. Phase 1, the immediate neutralization of the physical threat, was complete. Phase 2, a full-spectrum analysis of Brenda Butterfield and the Meadowbrook Estates HOA was about to commence. I closed the door, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. My first call wasn't to Sarah, not yet. I didn't want to worry her until I had a clearer picture. My first call was to a name buried deep in my contacts list: Marcus Glitch Petrocelli. Glitch was a legend in certain circles, a digital ghost who could make data sing, dance, and confess its deepest secrets. We'd worked together on a particularly nasty cyber espionage case a few years back. He owed me one. More importantly, he loved this kind of thing. Puncturing the overinflated egos of petty tyrants was a hobby for him. Parker, his voice crackled over the secure line. Long time. Don't tell me you've finally decided to embrace the glorious chaos of off-grid living and need me to spoof your GPS for a permanent fishing trip. Not quite, Glitch, I said, pacing my study, the earlier intelligence brief forgotten. I've got a situation, domestic. Ho, Glitch groaned. An HOA? Parker, I deal with state-sponsored hackers, international crime syndicates. You want me to go after Karen Prime? This one's special, Glitch. She tried to evict me. With HOA cops. There was a pause, then a low whistle. Evict a federal agent? Ballsy. Or terminally stupid. I'm leaning towards the latter. What do you need? Everything, I said. Brenda Butterfield, Meadowbrook Estates. Oh, finances, meeting minutes, bylaws, any complaints filed against her, her personal dealings, connections, pet preferences, favorite brand of cheap Chardonnay, the works. I want to know where every penny of HOA dues has gone for the last 5 years. I want to know if she's using association funds for her golf cart detailing. I want to know if she's rigging board elections. I want a full workup, top to bottom. Consider it a deep dive character study. Glitch chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Consider it done. This sounds like more fun than my last gig tracing dark web Bitcoin launderers. They were so predictable. An HOA president with delusions of grandeur? That's artisanal crazy. I'll have a preliminary package for you by 800 tomorrow. You want it encrypted with the usual protocols? Naturally. And Glitch? Discretion is paramount. This needs to be clean, untraceable back to me for now. She doesn't know the storm that's coming. I'd like to keep it that way until landfall. Parker, my friend, Glitch said, a hint of amusement in his voice. When I move through the digital world, I'm a whisper in the quantum foam. She won't even know her data's been caressed by a master. You just prepare the stage for the fireworks. With Glitch on the case, I felt a grim satisfaction. Brenda had operated in the shadows of neighborhood apathy and procedural obscurity. I was about to shine a federal-grade spotlight into those shadows. My next step was to review the documents Brenda had thrust at me, the eviction notice. It was, as expected, a masterpiece of pseudo-legal gibberish, citing bylaws that were either misinterpreted or entirely fabricated. The persistent and egregious violations listed were comical. Failure to maintain aesthetic uniformity in window treatments. Sarah liked sheer curtains in the kitchen. Brenda preferred opaque blinds. Unauthorized cultivation of non-native flora. A patch of lavender Sarah had planted. And the perennial favorite, improperly positioned, refuse receptacles. There was no mention of the satellite dish, which confirmed my suspicion that it was an unspoken, perhaps primary grievance. This wasn't just about rules. It was about control, absolute and unquestioned. The authority to reclaim property was based on a clause so vaguely worded It could mean anything or nothing, clearly never intended for such drastic action without extensive due process, court orders, and actual egregious, irredeemable breaches, like turning your house into a meth lab, not planting lavender. I started a new file on my secure drive. Operation Beige Storm. It was time to treat this not as a neighborhood spat, but as a counterintelligence operation against a hostile domestic entity. Brenda Butterfield was the target. Her power base was the HOA board. Her weapons were the bylaws and community apathy. My objective: complete dismantlement of her authority and a full accounting for her abuses. I pulled up the county property records, the state business filings for the HOA. Standard procedure, cross-referencing names, dates, looking for anomalies. The initial sweep was unremarkable, a typical suburban HOA structure. But Brenda had been president for 10 years. 10 years is a long time to consolidate power, to learn the loopholes, to embed loyalists. As I worked, the quiet hum of my dedicated server array filled the room, a counterpoint to the chirping birds outside. Birds whose feeders were probably also in violation of some obscure HOA edict. The irony was not lost on me. I dealt with threats to national security, with individuals and groups who sought to undermine the very foundations of the country. And here I was, locked in a battle with a woman whose greatest ambition seemed to be dictating the precise shade of beige for everyone's mailbox. But power, I knew, was power. And its abuse, whether on a global scale or in a quiet cul-de-sac, stemmed from the same dark wellspring of human nature. Brenda's tyranny was petty, but it was tyranny nonetheless, affecting the lives and peace of mind of dozens of families. And I, through a bizarre twist of fate and fuchsia petunias, was uniquely positioned to end it. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across my desk, mirroring the ones that had been on the porch. Sarah would be home soon. I'd have to tell her. She wouldn't be surprised by Brenda's escalation, only by its sheer audacity. And she, like me, would not stand for it. This was our home. We had built a life here, a sanctuary. Brenda had tried to violate that sanctuary. She had mistaken our desire for quiet enjoyment for an invitation to dominate. That was a miscalculation of critical proportions. By morning, Glitch's preliminary report would be in. The reconnaissance phase was well underway. The battlefield was being mapped. And Brenda Butterfield, currently nursing her wounded pride, and, I imagined, a very large glass of Chardonnay, had no idea that the reluctant warrior she'd prodded had just unsheathed his sword. This wouldn't be a quick kill. It would be a meticulous, legally sound, and utterly devastating takedown. She wanted rules. She was about to get a masterclass in them. Glitch's preliminary package arrived at 758, encrypted to a level that would make a state security agency sweat. The man was a digital artist. Within minutes, I had decrypted it, the contents unfurling across my monitors like a battle plan. Parker, the attached note read, "This isn't just artisanal crazy, it's a full-blown buffet. Your HOA Karen isn't just a petty tyrant. She's a surprisingly methodical embezzler with a penchant for creative accounting. Attached, OA financials for the last 7 years, cross-referenced with Brenda Butterfield's personal bank statements. Don't ask, just enjoy. Board meeting minutes, some very interesting redactions and lost recordings, and a collection of anonymous emails from concerned homeowners that were conveniently ignored by the board. Highlight: the Community Beautification Fund appears to have primarily beautified Brenda's new Lexus and funded several fact-finding missions to Napa Valley. Apparently, observing vineyards is crucial for selecting appropriate shrubbery for Meadowbrook. Who knew? This is just the appetizer. Main course to follow. Enjoy the beige storm, G. My lips curved into a grim smile. Embezzlement. That elevated things considerably. This was no longer just about civil harassment. This was potentially criminal. The beautification fund was a black hole. Money flowing in from special assessments levied on homeowners and flowing out to vendors with no online presence, no business licenses, just post office boxes and checks cashed by entities linked back through a series of shell accounts Glitch had expertly unraveled to Brenda herself. The Napa trips were listed as landscape consultations. The Lexus, leased through an LLC whose sole director was Brenda's maiden aunt, who lived in a nursing home and probably thought an LLC was a type of biscuit. The sheer, unadulterated gall of it was impressive in its own sordid way. I spent the next few hours cross-referencing Glitch's findings with publicly available records, building a timeline, a meticulous chain of evidence. The lost recordings of board meetings often coincided with contentious budget approvals. The redactions in minutes often obscured dissenting voices, usually from board members who mysteriously resigned shortly thereafter, citing personal reasons. Brenda had cultivated a compliant board, a rubber stamp for her larceny. My next call was to Eleanor Vance. Ellie was a bulldog of a prosecutor I'd worked with when I was attached to a white-collar crime task force. She had a mind like a steel trap and a burning hatred for fraudsters who preyed on the vulnerable, or, in this case, the apathetic. She was now in private practice, specializing in complex civil litigation and forensic accounting. "Alex Parker," she answered, her voice crisp and no nonsense. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Last I heard, you were chasing spooks in undisclosed locations. Ellie, I need your particular brand of legal lethality," I said. "I've stumbled into a local cesspool, and it turns out the queen rat has been lining her nest with community funds. I gave her the condensed version, the attempted eviction, the HOA presidency, and Glitch's preliminary findings." I could almost hear her sharp legal mind whirring through the connection. An HOA president using the association as her personal piggy bank? "Shocking," she said, her voice dripping with the kindest of sarcasm. "Send me what you have. If it's as ripe as you say, we can make her life exceedingly uncomfortable. Civil suits, demands for forensic audits, injunctions. We can tie her up in so much legal red tape she'll think she's a Christmas present from hell. That's precisely the aesthetic I'm aiming for, Ellie. But I want to do this by the numbers, clean and precise. This isn't just about punishing her. It's about making the other homeowners whole and ensuring this kind of abuse can't happen again here." Noble, Parker, very noble, and entirely billable. She added a hint of dry humor in her voice. "Send the data dump. I'll clear my afternoon." This sounds far more entertaining than the patent dispute I was wading through. I transmitted Glitch's encrypted package to Ellie's secure portal. While she began her legal autopsy, I turned my attention to the Meadowbrook Estates bylaws and CCRs, the very documents Brenda had weaponized. I read them cover to cover, then again, highlighting ambiguities, contradictions, and, most importantly, the procedures for calling special meetings, for removing board members, and for demanding financial transparency. Brenda had relied on homeowners not reading the fine print, on their unwillingness to challenge her interpretations. She'd counted on their inertia. That was about to change. I started drafting. Not legal complaints yet. That was Ellie's domain. But a series of pointed questions and information requests citing specific bylaw articles to be sent to the HOA board. Each question was a carefully laid snare designed to expose their negligence or complicity. Pursuant to Article X, Section 3, requiring quarterly financial disclosures, Please provide unredacted bank statements for all HOA accounts for the past 24 months. Regarding Article 5, Section 2, on competitive bidding for contracts exceeding 5.0, please furnish all bids and selection justifications for the landscaping contract awarded to Evergreen Visions LLC, a company Glitch had already flagged as another of Brenda's fronts. Each request was polite, formal, and utterly damning in its implications. Brenda would receive these. She would know I was digging. Let her sweat. Let her wonder how much I knew. The psychological pressure was as important as the legal maneuvering. Sarah came home that evening to find me surrounded by printouts, my expression grim. I told her everything, from the fuchsia petunias to the attempted eviction to Glitch's findings of embezzlement. She listened, her initial shock giving way to a quiet fury that mirrored my own. "That woman," Sarah said, her voice tight, "tried to throw us out of our house over lavender while she was stealing from everyone. Lily's college fund is partly built on the equity in this house. Our neighbors, the Hendersons, are retired and on a fixed income. She's stealing from them." "Exactly," I said. "This isn't just about us anymore." She crossed the line with me, and that was a mistake. But what she's done to this community, that's unforgivable. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. She knew the look in my eyes. It was the same look I had before deploying on a high-stakes operation. "I'm going to dismantle her, Sarah. Legally, meticulously, and publicly. She built her little empire on lies and intimidation. I'm going to tear it down with truth and due process." Later that night, I walked through our quiet house. Lily was asleep, her breathing soft and even. Sarah was reading in bed, the tension slowly leaving her shoulders as she saw the resolve in mine. This house, these walls, they represented safety, stability. Brenda Butterfield, in her arrogance, had threatened that. She had mistaken a federal agent's desire for domestic tranquility as a sign of weakness. She didn't realize that the skills honed tracking international criminals, patience, attention to detail, an unwavering commitment to seeing justice done, were perfectly transferable to dismantling a corrupt HOA president. The legal groundwork was being laid. The evidence was accumulating. Brenda was still issuing fines. I received a notice for unapproved reflective surfaces on my car's hubcaps, delivered with a smug little note about prompt payment. Blissfully unaware that the ground beneath her beige throne was about to liquefy, she thought this was still her game, her rules. She hadn't yet grasped that I was rewriting the entire rule book, using her own bylaws as the ink. The trap was being set, piece by meticulous piece. The first barrage was subtle, almost polite. A series of certified letters delivered to Brenda Butterfield in her capacity as HOA president, and copied to every other board member. Each letter, drafted with Ellie Vance's surgical precision, requested specific financial documents, meeting minutes, and contract details, all citing the HOA's own governing documents. They were, on the surface, simple requests for transparency. Beneath the surface, they were torpedoes aimed at the waterline of Brenda's meticulously constructed facade. The return receipts, signed by a flustered-looking Brenda, were scanned and added to my Operation Beige Storm file. I could almost picture her reaction. Initial annoyance, then perhaps a dawning unease as she realized the requests were too specific, too knowledgeable. She would try to stonewall, of course. Delay, obfuscate, claim the documents were unavailable or archived off-site. Standard procedure for the guilty. But Ellie and I had anticipated that. The letters contained clear deadlines for response, citing bylaw requirements for timely disclosure to members. Failure to comply would trigger the next phase. While Brenda was dealing with that initial salvo, Glitch delivered his main course. It was a forensic accounting masterpiece, tracing every misdirected dollar, every bogus invoice, every consultation in Napa that conveniently coincided with a wine festival. He'd even found evidence of Brenda pressuring vulnerable elderly residents into signing proxies for board votes, effectively rigging her re-elections. The sheer volume of her malfeasance was staggering. It wasn't just casual skimming, it was systematic plunder. "Parker," Glitch's note read, "your Karen isn't just a thief, she's a goddamn artist of the grift. She's got shell companies within shell companies. It's like Russian nesting dolls of fraud. I've also included a little bonus, her online shopping history. Let's just say the Community Beautification Fund also apparently funded a truly astonishing collection of animal print activewear. You're welcome." I allowed myself a mirthless smile. The animal print activewear was a touch of comedic gold in an otherwise sordid saga. Ellie, upon receiving Glitch's full report, was practically vibrating with prosecutorial zeal. "Alex," she said, her voice crackling with energy, "this is beyond civil. This is grand larceny. This is wire fraud. This is racketeering, HOA style. We need to get this to the DA's white-collar crime unit. But first, let's tighten the civil vice until she squeals." The HOA cops, the two goons Brenda had hired, were next. Their Meadowbrook security was a shell, unlicensed and uninsured. A sharply worded cease and desist letter from Ellie, detailing their illegal eviction attempt, potential charges of harassment, trespass, and impersonating peace officers, was dispatched to the P.O. box that served as their headquarters. Copied, of course, to the State Licensing Board for Security Services. Within 48 hours, a terrified phone call came into Ellie's office from a man identifying himself as Barry the Bear Kowalski. Paunchy, no doubt, profusely apologizing, blaming Brenda for misleading them, and swearing his security firm, which apparently consisted of him and his nephew Jumpy, would never set foot in Meadowbrook Estates again. He even offered to testify against Brenda. Ellie took his statement. One less pawn on Brenda's board. The ripple effects began. Brenda, predictably, missed the deadlines for providing the requested financial documents. Her response was a curt, dismissive letter, stating the board was reviewing the requests and would respond in due course, a classic bureaucratic brush-off. This triggered Ellie to file the first round of motions in civil court, a petition to compel disclosure of records, and a request for an immediate, court-ordered independent forensic audit of the HOA's finances. Served directly to Brenda at her home, this time by a grim-faced professional process server who wouldn't be intimidated by a golf cart. The news of legal action started to filter through the neighborhood. I'd made a point of being visible, calmly doing yard work strictly to code, of course, much to Brenda's visible frustration as she'd drive by, nodding politely to neighbors. Some were still wary, conditioned by years of Brenda's bullying. But others, like old Mr. Henderson, who'd once been fined for the unapproved hue of his prize-winning roses, gave me a subtle thumbs up. My sidekick, as it were, emerged in the form of Mrs. Rodriguez from 2 streets over, a retired librarian with a razor-sharp mind and a long simmering resentment of Brenda's reign. She'd been quietly collecting her own dossier of Brenda's petty tyrannies for years. When she heard I was taking legal action, she appeared at my door with a meticulously organized binder of notes, dated complaints, and even grainy photos of Brenda using HOA-paid landscapers to resod her own lawn. "I knew someone would eventually have the stomach for it, Mr. Parker," she said, her eyes bright. "She called my bird feeder avian slum housing and fined me. Me, I've been a card-carrying member of the Audubon Society for 40 years. Mrs. Rodriguez became an invaluable ally, a conduit to the silent majority. She started a discreet email chain, sharing carefully vetted information about the legal proceedings. Nothing confidential, just the public filings. And the rights of homeowners under the bylaws. Slowly, cautiously, the neighborhood began to awaken. Brenda tried to fight back, of course. A flurry of new violation notices appeared on my door. Excessive water runoff from sprinkler system. It had rained the night before. Non-uniform mailbox lettering height, by a millimeter perhaps. Failure to display adequate patriotic sentiment. I hadn't put up a flag for National Pretzel Day, which Brenda had unilaterally declared a mandatory flag-flying occasion. Each notice was logged, photographed, and forwarded to Ellie, adding to the growing mountain of evidence of harassment and retaliation. One evening, Brenda cornered me as I was getting the mail. Her face was tight with fury, the mask of civility completely gone. You think you're so clever, don't you, Mr. Parker, with your lawyers and your fancy letters? You're disrupting this community. You're turning people against me. Brenda, I said, my voice calm, my gaze steady. I'm simply asking for transparency and accountability, as is my right as a homeowner. If the truth turns people against you, perhaps you should examine the truth, not the messenger. This HOA is mine, she hissed, spittle flying. I built it. I made it what it is. And what is that, Brenda? I asked quietly. A well-maintained community, or a personal fiefdom funded by your neighbor's money. She recoiled as if struck. For a moment, I thought she might actually swing at me. Instead, she spun on her heel and stomped back to her golf cart, muttering about ungrateful troublemakers. Her power was eroding, and she knew it. The court granted Ellie's motion to compel disclosure. Brenda was ordered to turn over all financial records within 10 days or face contempt charges. The pressure was mounting. She was trapped. Her usual tactics of bluster and intimidation useless against the cold, impartial machinery of the law. She thought this was a war of attrition she could win, like she always had. She didn't understand. For me, this wasn't attrition. This was strategy. Every move was calculated, every document a weapon, every legal filing a step closer to checkmate. She was playing checkers. I was playing three-dimensional chess, with the full weight of the U.S. Code as my queen. The offensive was in full swing. The air in Meadowbrook Estates was changing. You could almost smell the fear emanating from Brenda's meticulously kept beige house. And for the first time in a long time, you could also smell hope. The upcoming annual HOA meeting, traditionally a state affair where Brenda would railroad her agenda through with minimal discussion, was now a looming battleground. Whispers turned into hushed conversations, then into open speculation. Mrs. Rodriguez, my librarian-turned-insurgent comms officer, had been working tirelessly. She'd set up an anonymous tip line, a simple, untraceable email address, and homeowners, emboldened by the legal actions and the cracks appearing in Brenda's authority, began to share their own stories of petty fines, intimidation, and suspected financial mismanagement. Each anecdote, each piece of photocopied correspondence, was another nail in Brenda's coffin. Ellie Vance, meanwhile, was preparing for the DA. The evidence Glitch had unearthed, combined with the HOA's forced disclosures, which, when finally produced under court order, were riddled with inconsistencies and poorly doctored figures that only highlighted the fraud, painted a clear picture of criminal activity. The DA's office is very interested, Alex, Ellie reported, a note of grim satisfaction in her voice. They're assigning a senior prosecutor from the Economic Crimes Unit. Warrants might be forthcoming, but they want to see how the civil side plays out first. Let Brenda hang herself a bit more with her own rope at this HOA meeting. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the community clubhouse, a building whose recent Renovations had cost 3 times the initial estimate and involved Brenda's brother-in-law's suspiciously new construction company. I arrived early with Sarah. The room was already more crowded than I'd ever seen it. Usually, only a handful of diehards and Brenda's bored cronies attended. Tonight, it was standing room only. Mr. Henderson was there, leaning on his cane, his eyes sharp. Mrs. Rodriguez gave me a subtle nod from across the room, a stack of printouts discreetly tucked into her tote bag. Even some of the younger families, usually too busy to engage, were present, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. Brenda sat at the head table, flanked by her 2 remaining loyal board members, a nervous-looking treasurer named Stan and a perpetually bewildered retiree named Doris. Brenda's smile was brittle, her eyes darting around the room, assessing the unexpectedly large crowd. She looked like a cornered animal. She banged the gavel. "Welcome, everyone, to the annual meeting of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association," she began, her voice a little too loud, a little too forced. "We have a lot to get through tonight, so let's keep things orderly." She tried to rush through the agenda. Approval of last year's minutes, the ones with the convenient redactions. The treasurer's report, a masterpiece of obfuscation delivered by a sweating Stan. And then, quickly, onto new business, where she clearly intended to ram through another budget full of vague beautification line items. But before she could, a hand went up. It was Mr. Henderson. "Point of order, Madam President," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. "Before we approve any new budgets, I believe many of us have questions about the old budgets. Specifically, about the significant discrepancies and lack of transparency that have recently come to light." A murmur went through the crowd. Brenda's face tightened. "Mr. Henderson, all financial reports have been made available as per the bylaws." "Not voluntarily, Brenda," I interjected, my voice calm but carrying easily through the room. "They were produced under court order, and even then they raise more questions than they answer." I stood up. All eyes turned to me. I had a small projector and a laptop, courtesy of Glitch, who had insisted on full multimedia support for the takedown. "If I may," I said, "I'd like to share some information with my fellow homeowners. Information that directly impacts our dues, our property values, and the integrity of this association." Brenda started to sputter. "This is out of order. This is not on the agenda." "I believe," Mrs. Rodriguez called out, holding up a copy of the bylaws. "Article 12, Section 4, allows any member to introduce new business for discussion with the support of 10% of members present. I believe we have that support." A chorus of "ayes" and "here, here" erupted. Brenda's gavel, banging, was drowned out. Defeated, she slumped back in her chair, her face a mask of fury. I dimmed the lights slightly and turned on the projector. The first slide was simple. Meadowbrook Estates HOA. Where does your money go? Then, one by one, I presented Glitch's findings, translated into clear, easy-to-understand charts and summaries. The inflated contracts, the payments to shell companies, the Napa landscape consultations with accompanying photos of Brenda sipping wine at exclusive vineyards, time-stamped during alleged HOA business trips, the Lexus, registered to the LLC, parked in Brenda's driveway. Each slide was a hammer blow. Gas rippled through the room. Stan, the treasurer, looked physically ill, shrinking under the collective gaze of his neighbors. Doris just looked confused, as if wondering how wine tastings related to petunia selection. I showed them the doctored invoices, the lost meeting minutes juxtaposed with emails from former board members who had questioned Brenda's spending and were subsequently forced out. I showed them the pattern of proxy abuse. "This isn't just mismanagement, folks," I said, my voice resonating with controlled anger. This is a systematic diversion of our community funds for personal enrichment. We, the homeowners, have been footing the bill for Ms. Butterfield's lavish lifestyle, while our community infrastructure crumbles and our legitimate concerns are dismissed with bogus fines. Then came the questions. Homeowners who had been silent for years finally found their voices. What about the special assessment for the pool resurfacing that never happened? Where did the money for the playground equipment that was promised 3 years ago go? Why was my roof repair denied by the architectural committee when Brenda's cousin got us approved for an identical issue? Brenda tried to interject, to deny, to bluster, but her voice was lost in the rising tide of anger and betrayal. Stan, under pressure, finally cracked. I just signed what Brenda told me to sign, he stammered, tears welling in his eyes. She said it was all approved, all legitimate. Doris, bless her heart, piped up. Brenda told me the wine trips were essential for understanding drought-resistant planting. She said California was leading the way. The dark situational irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Mr. Henderson stood again, his voice trembling with righteous fury. Brenda Butterfield, you have betrayed our trust. You have stolen from your neighbors. You have turned this community into your personal piggy bank. I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in President Butterfield and any board member complicit in these actions. The room erupted in agreement. Mrs. Rodriguez, ever prepared, produced pre-printed ballots. The vote was overwhelming. Brenda Butterfield was removed as president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, effective immediately. Stan, the treasurer, resigned on the spot, sobbing. Doris, looking utterly bewildered, abstained, muttering something about needing to research California viticulture herself. Brenda sat stunned, her face ashen. The gavel lay untouched before her. Her reign, built on a foundation of beige paint and barefaced lies, had crumbled in a single evening under the bright, unforgiving light of truth. As the meeting broke up, people crowded around me, shaking my hand, thanking me. There was a sense of liberation in the air, but also anger and a determination to clean house. Sarah squeezed my arm, her eyes shining with pride. You did it. Alex, she whispered. You gave them back their community. I looked over at Brenda. She was still sitting at the table, alone now, a solitary figure amidst the discarded ballots and the wreckage of her little empire. Her eyes met mine, filled not with defiance, but with a dawning, terrifying understanding of the true cost of her actions. This public humiliation was just the beginning. The legal wolves were circling, and they were hungry. The reckoning was far from over. The fallout from the HOA meeting was swift and brutal for Brenda. The very next morning, before the dew had even dried on the non-compliant lavender in my wife's garden, 2 stern-faced individuals in dark suits knocked on Brenda Butterfield's meticulously painted front door. They weren't from Meadowbrook Security. They were detectives from the county DA's Economic Crimes Unit, and they had a warrant. Not for an eviction, but for her arrest. The charges, as Ellie Vance had predicted, were comprehensive. Multiple counts of grand larceny, embezzlement, wire fraud, and even a few counts of forgery related to the doctored financial statements. The news spread through Meadowbrook Estates like wildfire. Neighbors gathered in small, hushed groups, watching as a handcuffed Brenda, no longer the imperious monarch of the cul-de-sac, but a pale, disheveled woman, was escorted to an unmarked police car. The sight of her, stripped of her golf cart and her clipboard scepter, was a stark visual metaphor for the collapse of her tyranny. There was no triumph in watching it, only a somber sense of justice beginning its inexorable course. The local corruption ties Glitch had hinted at began to surface. The brother-in-law's construction company, which had handled the overpriced clubhouse renovations, came under scrutiny. It turned out he'd been kicking back a percentage to Brenda. Several vendors who had received lucrative no-bid contracts for landscaping services and pool maintenance, despite the pool remaining stubbornly unresurfaced, were also implicated. Some of these vendors had connections to local council members, suggesting a wider net of low-level graft that Brenda had tapped into. The DA's investigation was expanding. My role in her arrest was indirect but pivotal. The evidence packet I'd compiled with Glitch's digital wizardry and Ellie's legal acumen had provided the roadmap for the investigators. They had simply followed the money, a trail Brenda had foolishly believed was too convoluted to trace. Ellie pursued the civil actions with vigor. With Brenda's assets frozen pending the criminal trial, the civil court appointed an independent receiver to manage the HOA's finances and oversee the election of a new interim board. The first act of the receiver, after reviewing the catastrophic state of the books, was to issue a formal apology to all homeowners for the gross mismanagement and fraudulent activities of the previous administration. He also immediately rescinded every outstanding fine Brenda had issued in the last 6 months, citing clear evidence of retaliatory and arbitrary enforcement. A small cheer went up in the Parker household when that notice arrived. Even Lily, who only vaguely understood the adult drama, sensed that something good had happened, that the mean lady who didn't like her chalk drawings was no longer in charge. The legal battle was far from over, but Brenda's power was irrevocably broken. Her attempts to secure bail were initially denied due to flight risk. Those Napa fact-finding trips suddenly looked less like research and more like scouting potential escape routes. Eventually, she was released on a hefty bond, secured against the heavily mortgaged beige house that was once her castle. The HOA cops, Barry the Bear Kowalski and his nephew, became key witnesses for the prosecution, eagerly detailing how Brenda had instructed them, pressured them, and assured them of her absolute authority to evict me. Their testimony painted a picture of a woman so consumed by her own power that she believed herself above the law. As for Brenda's remaining loyalists on the old board, Doris, the bewildered retiree, cooperated fully with investigators, providing a surprisingly detailed account of Brenda's manipulative tactics, all delivered with an air of innocent confusion that made her testimony all the more damning. She said the extra $5,000 for decorative fountain consulting was for a special kind of nozzle that repelled algae and promoted good feng shui, Doris explained to a detective who struggled to keep a straight face. Stan, the sobbing treasurer, also turned state's evidence, hoping for leniency. The community began to heal, but it was a slow process. Trust had been shattered. The interim board, composed of reluctant but responsible homeowners, including a grateful Mr. Henderson and an initially hesitant Mrs. Rodriguez, who quickly proved to be a formidable stickler for procedural correctness, faced the daunting task of untangling years of financial chaos and rebuilding faith in the HOA. They held open meetings, published transparent financial reports, and actually listened to homeowner concerns. It was revolutionary. The blood metaphor wasn't literal, of course, but the cost of Brenda's reign was evident everywhere. In the deferred maintenance, the depleted reserve funds, the broken trust between neighbors. There was also the psychic residue of the conflict, the lingering awareness of how easily petty power could curdle into outright corruption. My family life slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though the fuchsia petunias now bloomed with a certain defiant pride. Sarah planted more lavender. Lily's sidewalk art became more elaborate, a vibrant explosion of color on the once drab pavement. The unapproved bird bath my grandfather had carved became a quiet symbol of resilience. Brenda Butterfield, once a neighborhood scourge, became a cautionary tale. Her legal proceedings dragged on, a slow, public dismantling of her reputation and finances. The animal print activewear, presumably, remained unworn in her closet, a monument to ill-gotten gains. The fight had been intensely personal, but the victory felt communal. It wasn't just my home I had defended. It was the principle that no one, no matter how inflated their ego, or how official sounding their title, should be allowed to trample on the rights of others. The cold, calculated vengeance I had initially felt had given way to a more somber satisfaction. Justice was being served, not swiftly, but with methodical precision. And in Meadowbrook Estates, the era of beige tyranny was finally, definitively over. The porch light, once a beacon against Brenda's encroaching darkness, now simply illuminated a peaceful suburban street, a street slowly learning to breathe again. The months that followed Brenda's arrest and the installation of the interim HOA board were a period of cautious recalibration for Meadowbrook Estates. The air, once thick with suspicion, and the unspoken threat of Brenda's next arbitrary edict, gradually cleared. Neighbors started talking to each other again, not just in hushed tones about the Brenda situation, but about mundane things, gardening tips, school events, the weather. It was as if a low-grade fever that had afflicted the community for years had finally broken. The interim board, with Mrs. Rodriguez proving to be an unexpectedly astute treasurer, every receipt will be accounted for, down to the last paperclip, Mr. Henderson, worked diligently. They commissioned a full, independent audit, which confirmed Glitch's findings and unearthed even more layers of Brenda's petty graft. Small victories, like the recovery of some misappropriated funds from a consultant who quickly settled when faced with legal action, were celebrated quietly. The infamous Community Beautification Fund was repurposed, its first legitimate project being the long-overdue resurfacing of the community pool. Completed on time and under budget by a reputable local contractor, selected through a transparent bidding process. Children's laughter finally echoed from the newly refurbished pool area, a sound that had been conspicuously absent under Brenda's joyless regime. My own life settled back into its familiar cadence of redacted reports and classified briefings. But the Meadowbrook incident had left an indelible mark. It was a stark reminder that abuses of power weren't confined to geopolitical stages or shadowy syndicates. They could fester in the most mundane of settings, fueled by the same human failings of greed and arrogance. My family, the anchor that had initially led me to tolerate Brenda's harassment, had also been the catalyst for my decision to fight back. Protecting Lily's innocent world, Sarah's peace of mind, and the sanctity of our home had been non-negotiable. The fuchsia petunias, now thriving in their taupe planter, a small ironic nod to the old regime, became a private symbol. Sarah often joked that they were victory flowers. The symbolic revenge, if it could be called that, wasn't tied to a grand family legacy of battling tyrants, but to a simpler, more fundamental principle my grandfather had instilled in me. You don't let bullies win, especially when they're picking on people who can't easily fight back. The old granite bird bath he'd carved stood steadfast, water glistening in its shallow basin, a quiet testament to enduring values in a world too often swayed by fleeting power grabs. One afternoon, months later, I saw Brenda. She was at a discount grocery store several towns over, no longer in her power golf cart, but pushing a squeaky shopping cart. Her formerly immaculate coif was disheveled, her expensive clothes replaced by something drab and ill-fitting. She looked older, diminished, the fire of her arrogance extinguished, replaced by a dull, weary resignation. Our eyes met briefly across a display of bruised apples. There was no recognition in hers, or perhaps she chose not to acknowledge me. I felt no triumph, no lingering anger, only a faint, clinical pity. She was just another casualty of her own hubris, a ghost haunting the bargain aisles. The porch light at our house, the one that had been on during that first confrontational evening, continued to shine. It was no longer a defiant beacon against an encroaching darkness, but a symbol of restored order, of a home reclaimed and secured. It represented the return to control, not just for my family, but for the neighborhood. The locked gate, a visual metaphor from my professional world, signifying the successful conclusion of an operation, found its suburban equivalent in the newfound peace of Meadowbrook Estates. The psychological closure wasn't just mine, it was shared by many. The silent majority had found its voice, and they were determined not to lose it again. The new HOA, eventually formalized with elected members, Mrs. Rodriguez was unanimously voted in as treasurer, a role she accepted with grim determination, operated with a transparency that would have given Brenda apoplexy. Meetings were well attended, budgets were scrutinized, and decisions were made by consensus, not decree. The experience had forged a stronger, more vigilant community. They had learned the hard way that apathy was the soil in which petty tyranny thrived. As for me, the reluctant warrior had sheathed his sword, but kept it sharpened. The skills I'd used, the meticulous investigation, the strategic planning, the calm assertion of lawful authority, were part of my professional toolkit. But applying them to protect my own hearth and home had been a profoundly personal endeavor. It reinforced the core reasons I did what I did for a living: to uphold the rule of law, to protect the vulnerable, and to ensure that power, in whatever form, was wielded responsibly. The beige had not entirely vanished from Meadowbrook Estates. Some people genuinely liked taupe, it turned out, but it was no longer a color imposed by fiat. It was a choice. And choice, I reflected, was at the heart of what we'd fought for. The choice to plant fuchsia petunias. The choice to have a voice in how your community was run. The choice to live without fear of arbitrary reprisal from a self-appointed queen. The storm had passed, leaving cleaner air and a landscape subtly, irrevocably changed. The legal process against Brenda Butterfield ground on, as legal processes tend to do, with agonizing slowness, but undeniable momentum. Ellie Vance kept me updated. Preliminary hearings, motions filed by Brenda's increasingly desperate defense attorney, a bottom feeder who specialized in hopeless cases, and the steady accumulation of discovery materials that painted an ever bleaker picture for the former HOA queen. The DA's office was building an ironclad case. Glitch's digital forensics were unassailable, the paper trail was damning, and the witness testimonies from former board members, disgruntled homeowners, and even Barry the Bear, Kowalski, were devastating. My own involvement, post-initial takedown, was minimal, mostly consisting of providing sworn affidavits and being on call for potential testimony, though Ellie suspected the DA would rely more on the financial experts and direct victims of the embezzlement. My status reveal had been the catalyst, the shock that broke Brenda's carefully constructed illusion of untouchability, but the subsequent dismantling was a collaborative effort of law and community. I often found myself in my study, the hum of the servers a familiar comfort, reflecting on the whole sordid affair. It was a microcosm, a domestic theater where grand themes of power, corruption, and justice had played out. My monologue-heavy inner commentary during the height of the beige storm had been a coping mechanism, a way to process the absurdity and the audacity of Brenda's actions through the lens of tactical thinking. Now, in the relative quiet of the aftermath, the reflections were less tactical, more philosophical. Was it truly vengeance I had sought, or was it something closer to a restoration of equilibrium? Brenda hadn't just violated HOA bylaws. She had violated a fundamental social contract, The implicit understanding that those in positions of even minor authority will act in good faith. Her actions were a betrayal, not just of financial trust, but of neighborly decency. The morally unflinching stance I'd adopted wasn't born of callousness, but of a deep-seated conviction that such betrayals demand a response. To ignore them, to allow them to fester, is to become complicit in the erosion of community itself. My training, my career, had been dedicated to confronting threats that were often far more dangerous, far more sophisticated. Yet, the core principle remained the same: identify the threat, analyze its vulnerabilities, and neutralize it within the bounds of the law. Brenda Butterfield, in her own small way, had been a threat to the peace and security of dozens of families. Her weapons weren't bombs or bullets, but bylaws and intimidation. My response had been appropriately scaled, using the tools of legal process and information, but wielded with the same precision and determination I would apply to a national security threat. One evening, Sarah found me staring out at the garden, where the fuchsia petunias now coexisted peacefully with her prize-winning roses whose hue, thankfully, had never fallen under Brenda's critical gaze. "Still thinking about her?" Sarah asked gently. "Not her specifically," I replied. "More about the Brendas of the world. The petty tyrants who get a little taste of power and let it consume them. It's a depressingly common pathology." "But you stopped this one," Sarah said, linking her arm through mine. "You showed everyone here that they didn't have to just endure it." That, I supposed, was the crux of it. The reluctant warrior archetype fit, not because I craved conflict, but because when conflict is thrust upon you, especially when it threatens your sanctuary, inaction is not an option for someone with my background. My authority, usually dormant in my civilian life, had been awakened, not for personal gain, but to re-establish a just order. The psychological closure, the locked gate, wasn't just about seeing Brenda face consequences. It was about seeing the neighborhood reclaim its autonomy, seeing Mr. Henderson walk with his head held a little higher, watching Mrs. Rodriguez expertly dissect a budget proposal at an HOA meeting with the precision of a seasoned auditor. It was about witnessing the transition from a silent, intimidated majority into an engaged, empowered community. The rhetorical flourishes I sometimes allowed myself in my internal monologues. She sowed the wind of petty tyranny. She reaped the whirlwind of due process. Were not for an audience, but for myself. A way of framing the narrative, of finding a certain grim poetry in the methodical application of justice. There was a cost, of course. The time, the emotional energy, the necessity of donning that cold, calculating persona that was usually reserved for the darker corners of my professional life. But it was a necessary cost. Some fights you don't choose. They choose you. And when they do, you answer the call with everything you have. The slow-burning moral authority I had tried to project wasn't an act. It was the genuine outrage of a citizen, a husband, a father, who also happened to possess a very particular set of skills. And Brenda Butterfield, in her monumental arrogance, had blundered right into them. She simply didn't know. The final act of Brenda Butterfield's Meadowbrook Estates melodrama played out not in a heated HOA meeting, but in the sterile, impersonal confines of a county courtroom. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence and the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence if convicted at trial, Brenda, on the advice of her beleaguered attorney, accepted a plea deal. Grand larceny, embezzlement. The charges were still severe, but the plea offered a slightly reduced sentence in exchange for avoiding a costly and embarrassing public trial. The courtroom was sparsely populated. Sarah and I were there, seated in the back, observers more than participants now. Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Rodriguez were also present, representing the community that Brenda had systematically plundered. Brenda herself was a shadow of her former imperious self. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a shapeless dark dress. Her hair, once a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde, was limp and streaked with gray. She looked tired, defeated, and, for the first time, perhaps truly comprehending the totality of her downfall. When the judge asked her how she pleaded to the charges, her voice was a hoarse whisper. "Guilty, Your Honor." The judge, a stern woman, with a reputation for having little patience for white-collar criminals, who preyed on their communities, delivered a scathing summary of Brenda's actions before pronouncing sentence. It included a period of incarceration, less than the maximum, but significant enough to be a profound deterrent, followed by a lengthy probation, and, crucially, a court-ordered restitution plan that would see Brenda paying back every cent she had stolen from the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, however long it took. Her beige house, already heavily mortgaged, would have to be sold. The proceeds would go towards the restitution. The Napa fact-finding trips were over. The Lexus had already been repossessed. As Brenda was led away, her shoulders slumped. A quiet sigh of relief rippled through the small contingent from Meadowbrook. It wasn't a cheer of victory, but the sound of a chapter, finally, irrevocably, closing. Later that day, back home, I stood on my porch. The fuchsia petunias blazed defiantly in the afternoon sun. Lily was drawing a vibrant, multicolored dragon on the driveway with sidewalk chalk, its scales an affront to any notion of beige uniformity. Sarah was tending her roses, humming softly. A new normal had settled over Meadowbrook Estates, a vigilant peace born from a shared ordeal. The HOA, under its new, transparent leadership, was functioning as it should, a facilitator of community well-being, not an instrument of personal enrichment and petty tyranny. My role in it had faded back to that of a regular homeowner, albeit one with a slightly more notorious reputation for not suffering fools gladly. The tactical justice fantasy, as some might have cynically termed it, had played out with real-world consequences, not just for Brenda, but for the fabric of our small suburban enclave. It had been a stark lesson in the corrosive nature of unchecked minor power and the resilience of a community when pushed too far. This experience, this unexpected detour into the bizarre world of HOA warfare, had, in a strange way, reaffirmed my commitment to my actual, far more serious, federal duties. It was a reminder that the fight against abuse of power, against those who seek to exploit and dominate, happens at all levels, from international intrigue to the politics of a petunia planter. You might think, listening to this, that it was all just an overblown neighborhood dispute, a tempest in a taupe teacup. But it was never just about the color of the petunias, or the height of the grass, or the angle of a parked car. It was about the arrogant assumption that rules were for little people, that accountability was optional for those in charge, that a title, however petty, conferred immunity. It was about the color of justice, and ensuring it shone clearly, even in the quietest of cul-de-sacs. They crossed a line, Brenda and her ilk. They mistook a desire for peace as weakness. They didn't know who I was, what I was capable of, or the lengths I would go to protect my home, my family, and the simple right to live without being lorded over by a tin-pot dictator in a golf cart. Now they knew. And Meadowbrook Estates, finally free of its beige overlord, could breathe again, its colors vibrant, and its future, for the first time in a long time, looking decidedly brighter than taupe. The gate was locked on that chapter, the mission accomplished. Time to get back to the larger shadows, where other, bigger Brendas undoubtedly lurked.